All right, everybody. Sorry, I'm coming in 2 minutes late. Hope you weren't afraid I was going to be a no-show again, like I was the other night. But I was doing another live stream on Facebook to let people know about this live stream, and I got the rainbow pinwheel of disaster. I don't know if we have any Mac users out there. I'm a little bit frightened because the last time I started getting the rainbow pinwheel of disaster, it meant that I had to replace my MacBook, and I really don't want to do that. There's a lot of better ways to spend one's money these days. So let's see. I don't know if anybody can see my costume today. Sometimes you just got to raid the 6-year-olds hairband collection. So I do feel pretty, if anybody's wondering, and witty and bright. So let's see who's joined us in the live chat. Before I do that, I'm just going to make sure if you're just tuning in, if you're watching one of my videos for the first time, this is a YouTube live stream of, let's say, the Jew Curious show. We've got a few different formats. We've got a podcast. We've got this YouTube channel where we do live streaming Q&As and discussions about topics. And this particular one is about why we wear costumes on Purim. There's sort of a few different levels to this. You know, costumes are fun, but it goes a lot deeper than that, let's say theologically and scripturally speaking. So we'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to acknowledge all the great people who have showed up. We've got Ruthie from Fullerton, California. And she says her kids are here as well, dressing up as the kids are dressing up as superheroes for Purim, the Super Honey family. Excellent. Kathy's here from California, USA. We've got waves, we've got smiles. What else have we got going on? We got our friend Teresa from Cyprus. Always happy to see Teresa here in the live stream. What else is going on? We got Vanessa from Germany. Thank you guys for joining me today. We are going to take a lot of people here are members of the Jew Curious School. So this is a little bit of learning that we did last week. If you are part of that community, and we talked a lot about the mitzvot of Purim, why we wear costumes, the whole issue of intoxication. This week for our YouTube audience, we are breaking those things down. Last night, late last night-ish, like 10:30 Pacific time, we talked about the 4 mitzvot of Purim, which are the main things that you make sure you get done on Purim if you want to observe Purim in a traditional way. And they're not necessarily what you may think of. It's not talking about the drinking so much, not talking about the costumes so much. But once we have that out of the way, today we're talking about the costumes. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Pacific, we're talking about the drinky drink part, or consuming intoxicants, whatever that means in whatever part of the world you are in and what things are legal there for intoxication. So let's see. We got Courtney here. Hey, what's up, Courtney from Seattle? So glad to see you here. Thank you for coming. Vanessa is going as Minnie Mouse. That is Minnie with 2 N's, not like a miniature mouse, like a mouse only smaller, but Minnie Mouse, who is, let's say, Mickey's Ezer Kenegdo. I don't know if they're married or if they're just, dating, but they're clearly fitting and equal counterparts. So I'm using the Breshit biblical phrase, Ezer Kenegdo, for that. Let's see. So we've got some great costumes coming in, and so glad to hear that people are preparing for Purim, really getting into the spirit. Somebody asked me last night, do you have to wear a costume in order to go to a Purim celebration? This person had been invited by some friends at a synagogue to come to their synagogue thing, and she's like, I don't have a costume. Can I still go? You absolutely can still go, right? You don't have to wear a costume as a condition of admittance. However, you should try a costume, right? And it could just be like a raggedy homemade costume. That's what I'm doing right now, as a matter of fact. But if you are not a costume person, if you are self-conscious about it, or for whatever reason, go and enjoy it. Enjoy the levity. Enjoy the festive nature of a Purim celebration. Enjoy other people's costumes. You do you. You do not have to wear a costume to go, but I recommend it if you have the means, if you have the motive, if you have the opportunity. That just sounded like a murder investigation, but we're going to move on from there. So got a lot of great people here in the chat. Kathy asks, are costumes supposed to be humorous? They can be. Costumes often are. I think there's just this sort of, and I'm a person who takes my sense of humor very seriously, and before I became a rabbi, I was actually, I'm going to confess to you guys, I was an open micer. I tried my hand at stand-up comedy for about 6 months on the open mic stages of Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's a reason I'm not doing that now, but I'll say it was probably the best preparation for public speaking I ever had. It's like the Marine boot camp of public speaking. But I take my sense of humor very seriously. I've thought about like the science as well as the art of humor, and so much of it comes from cognitive dissonance. You expect one thing and you receive another, and that creates a kind of tension or nervous energy that makes you laugh. And so when you see somebody who you know in everyday life and they appear very different, that makes you laugh. But sometimes it could be serious. Sometimes it could be social commentary. A teacher of mine, a rabbi at AJU, and her husband dressed up as News. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that. It's GNU. It's this sort of four-legged creature, like a water buffalo, kind of. I don't know, but it's called a gnu. And if you watched The Great Space Coaster like I did, you knew about Gary Gnu. He was a gnu who broadcast the news. But they both dressed up as News, like they had horns, but then they wore T-shirts that said "Not a real gnu," or like "Not a real GNU," with like a picture of an actual gnu on it. And so there were two of them. And so their costume was fake news. And that was very topical for the time. It's still topical today. Not going to get political in this podcast or this YouTube channel. But that was a statement. Sometimes it can be a statement. Sometimes you might just want to try on, as somebody suggested last night, 4th century Persian garb. Right? Sometimes you might want to make a political statement. Sometimes you might want to make a witty observation or a serious observation about current events. But anytime you see somebody who's sort of not themselves, it engenders laughter. It doesn't have to be humorous. It often is anyway. That's the nature of costumes. So let's see. Kathy says, we happen to like historical recreation costumes, but those may be out of place. So you do you. You absolutely, if you want to dress up like Esther, very popular Purim costume. I speak, of course, that the celebration of Purim itself was created by this event that we read about in the book of Esther, right, or Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, which is in the Ketuvim section of the Tanakh. And so you've got Esther, you've got her cousin / uncle Mordechai. Sometimes we call him an uncle. If you actually do the family tree math, he's more of a cousin, sort of an uncle's child. But he's older. It's clear that he has some sort of chaperone or guardian responsibility toward her. So we often say uncle when he's really a cousin. So people dress up like Uncle Morty, right? Uncle Mordechai, cousin Mordechai. People dress up like Esther. People dress up like King Achashverosh. People dress up like Haman, boo, who is famous for his three-cornered hat, forever immortalized in three-cornered cookies, Hamantaschen, or Haman's hat. Unless you're from Israel or speak Hebrew, in which case they're called Oznei Haman, or Haman's ears. Apparently he had this very Vulcan-like cartilaginous disorder where he had pointed triangular ears. So, not going to judge. But anyway, there's lots of different ways to celebrate Purim. Courtney asked, but not scary. I think that's what she was getting at. Okay, thank you very much. I love this Tosafot, if you will, this edition. So, yeah, it's not like if you're accustomed to dressing up for Halloween, sometimes people go for the scare. It's not like scary, gory, skeletons and zombies kind of stuff. It's more just fun, right? I believe my brothers and sisters from across the pond might call it a fancy dress party, not intending to scare people or freak people out, but to make people laugh or to raise their consciousness somehow. So thank you for clarifying that. Sister Spooky, speaking of spooky stuff, Sister Spooky on the chat says, hopefully I'm not too late. We are just getting started. This is just us talking. So you're never too late for these conversations. So really glad you're here today. I'm going to go ahead and jump into what I wanted to teach about why we wear costumes on Purim. And so there is, I'll say, a rabbinic phrase for one of the themes of the holiday of Purim, and that is Hester Panim. And Hester Panim means hiding the face, which is, okay, I'm not one to make puns. However, it is a rabbinic tradition of long standing to make puns or wordplay or we'll say folk etymologies. Not for nothing, it's called Esther, and this theme is called Hester Panim, or hiding the face. The name Esther itself, if you connect it to Hester, which means hiding, she herself is hiding through much of this story. In fact, in the beginning of the story of Purim, we're told that her name is not Esther, like her given name isn't Esther, but it's Hadassah. Like her name is Hadassah, which comes from, Hadass, which is a kind of plant. The Hadassah Society, people, Jewish women's organizations that support hospitals and good works like that, all related. So her birth name is Hadassah, but she also goes by Esther. In America today, people have different names. Jews who are born in America often have sort of their Hebrew name and their not Hebrew name, right? My name is John. My Hebrew name is Yitro, right? And when people convert, they get names, or they choose names for themselves. When Jewish children are born, their parents give them names. In Israel, where people are largely given Hebrew language names, their name on their birth certificate, the name they get called in the roll call at school, stuff on their driver's license, the whole bit, is often the same as their Hebrew name, right? You get one name, and they're both in Hebrew, or that one name is in Hebrew. In, let's say, diaspora culture, a child or an adult may have two names, right? One that they're called by that sort of matches the culture, matches the vernacular of the people that they're surrounded by, but also a special name that's in Hebrew that they're called to the Torah, or when, you write a ketubah, or you write something, some sort of legal document, we use their Hebrew name. So people can have, it's not uncommon today for people to have two names. And so I imagine that that's the same thing that Esther was going through. She was a Jewish person. She had a Hebrew name, Hadassah, and but she was in diaspora, not too far, right? Not so far away, on the same continent pretty much. But in Persia, perhaps her name was Esther for a different reason. But so there's different layers of hiddenness in this story. The most obvious is that in the story of Purim, Ahasuerus sends away his original or prior wife, decides to pick a new wife from among the maidens of his empire, and Esther wins this contest, this lottery, this what have you. So she becomes the queen, but she doesn't reveal that she's Jewish at the time. That was a discussion with her and her uncle cousin Mordecai, that she was just going to play along as a regular old Persian girl. It was only later, when we were on the verge of, I'll use this word, genocide, that to avert that genocide, Esther spoke up and said, if you're going to kill all the Jewish people in the kingdom, I'm Jewish too, so you're going to have to kill me, your wife. And that's when the tides turned for us. That's what we celebrate today. She was hidden, and then she had the courage to reveal her true identity, her, like, the fullness of her nature, and that saved us. This act of courage that could have ended very badly for her saved us, right? And that's why we celebrate Purim today. So what was hidden becomes revealed. There's another teaching that we wear costumes on Purim because of the hidden nature of Haman. Boo. So if you want to know why I keep booing when I say Haman, boo, watch last night's video on the 4 mitzvot of Purim. But it's said that because Haman sort of hid his personal feelings about the Jews, that's why we hide kind of our true selves or our true identities on Purim, right? He starts this whole ball rolling towards genocide because of a personal interaction with Uncle Cousin Mordecai, right? He's going around. He's the king's vizier, second in charge, vice king, whatever. And he's used to people bowing down to him. I read an interesting midrash this year that in fact he wore an idol around his neck, and when the people saw the idol, they would bow down. Right, so this was he kind of fixed it, if you will. They weren't really bowing down to him; they were bowing down to the idol that he wore. But he liked the feeling of having people bow down to him, and Mordecai refused to play along. Right, he says, "I don't bow to anyone except God, and that's not you." And because Mordecai didn't bow down to him, he took it out on the whole of the Jewish people, right? When he, excuse me, when he went to the king, he said, there's a people among us who don't follow the king's laws. They follow their own laws entirely, and we should dispose of this people. He didn't say anything to Ahasuerus, the king, about his personal beef with Mordecai. He just said, this is a people who are not on our side, right? You maybe recall a similar thing happening in Egypt, right? The king, a new king arose that did not know Yosef and decided, this people, maybe we go to battle with an enemy and this people sides with them. They're not necessarily loyal to us. We see this a lot, unfortunately, in anti-Semitic claims today of the dual loyalty of the Jewish people. That's an old trope. It's as disgusting and false today as it was in the time of Mordecai and Ahasuerus, as it was in the time of Pharaoh. This was a made-up thing that people used against us in a blanket way. And so Haman didn't reveal his personal animosity, which would have been petty on its face, to the king, but said instead, for political reasons and realpolitik, as I think Otto von Bismarck might have phrased it, we need to get rid of this people, right? But he hid the true nature of this. It wasn't because he was embarrassed that one time by that one guy. He ginned up the whole smear against an entire people. And so because Haman, this is just a midrash that I read this week, because Haman hid his true feelings or the base nature and ridiculous source of his feelings, that's why we kind of hide ourselves today. So we've got hiddenness on two levels so far. The most obvious is Esther hiding her identity. Esther sounding a lot, in a pun sort of way, to Hester, or hiding. Haman hiding the petty nature of his animosity toward the entirety of the Jewish people. And there's one more level, and this was the most surprising to me several years ago when I first learned about this, because I came to this stuff as an adult, y'all. You know that about me, or if you don't, you do now. Was when I learned that Megillat Esther, the story of Esther, is the one book in the entire Tanakh, that's the entire canonized Jewish scripture, where the name of God, the explicit name of God, does not appear one time. Right? That's pretty far out when you think about it. Like, the Bible is kind of God's book, right? It's like God's the most popular, most frequently appearing character. I hate to use that word character for this, but God's everywhere throughout the Bible, except apparently Megillat Esther, right? We don't talk about God one time. And so this would lead skeptics to question, is God involved in this story at all? There are times elsewhere in the scripture, and I'll say times in our own lives, where we feel God's absence. We wonder, gosh, nothing's going well for me right now. Is God just like not paying attention? Is it God's day off? Has God left the world that such terrible things can happen? Nevertheless, in every single other book in the Tanakh, God at least shows up once in a while. Sometimes withdraws and trusts us to work some things out for ourselves, but always returns when we most need God, except in the book of Esther. And, if when you're talking about the genocide of an entire people, namely the Jewish people, in the entirety of the Persian Empire, which was no joke. This was the time historians kind of link Ahasuerus to Xerxes the First or Artaxerxes the First, depending on who you read. But that's a lot of Jews, right? That's a lot of Jewish people who are at risk. You'd think, given other periods in the Bible, when we were slaves in Egypt, God showed up, right? God appeared to Moses in the burning bush and said, I need you to be kind of my front man, my spokesperson, but I'm going to come in there, throw down some plagues on y'all, and redeem this entire people. Right? God intervenes. God shows up in various places in the Torah, except in this place. And so people wonder, why would God leave us alone? And so the rabbis who couldn't tolerate the idea of God totally being absent of the world say, no, God is there. God is just hidden. This is the true essence of Hester Panim, right? God hides God's face, but doesn't give up responsibility, doesn't stop caring, but instead works through us. The president of my previous synagogue had a saying. It was that God has no hands but our hands. Right? We talk about God's mighty hand and outstretched arm in the story of Passover. Hate to spoil it for you. Coming up in about a month now, y'all. But our hands are the hands that physically do God's work in the world. And I think the story of Purim is a great illustration of this. I mean, these were loyal, heartfelt, faithful Jews acting as Jews do in the world. Mordechai, shepherding his charge through this difficult political process, difficult romantic process as well. Mordechai sticking to his principles of not bowing down to anybody except for God, right? That's where God shows up for me, is Mordechai saying, I'm a God person and I don't bow down to a dude, or if you believe the Midrash, the idol hanging around his neck, right? God is very present in that moment because Mordechai does something that not only risks his life, but every Jew's life in that story, in that moment, because of his personal connection to God, right? And Esther, by revealing herself to be Jewish, taps into this, I have to say, godlike courage in a moment where she could be killed and must have been inspired by something greater. In fact, Mordechai says to her, look, you can stand up or not. You can reveal yourself or not. If you don't, God will fix this in some other way. If it's not you, it'll be somebody else who saves our people. So why not you? And so you can see the workings of God through human beings throughout this story. There's a kind of an irony to the Purim story in my mind where, on the one hand, we see no overt revelation here, and yet we talk about what happened, and we see only human activities, and yet we talk about what happened in Purim as a miracle. Right? We consider it a miracle that we averted that disaster, so much so that two various blessings, to the Birkat Hamazon, the blessing, the grace after meals, also to the Amidah, when we say which is like our most kind of frequent prayer, we say the Amidah, the standing prayer, 3 times a day, every day of the year. On Purim, we add a paragraph. And it's the same, there's 2 times a year that we add this particular paragraph that's called Al Hanisim. Like, we bless God on account of the miracles that we see in the world. And we do this at Hanukkah, which is also a story where we hear more about human action than God's intervention. And at Purim, which is on the face of it entirely about human interaction, right, and human bravery and human decisions. And yet, in these stories where we don't see God explicitly like we do in, say, Exodus, we talk about it as a miracle, right? And so that's an acknowledgement that, sometimes people worry, life sucks. I'm just going to be very frank about that. That happens all the time. Sometimes life is great. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to get anybody depressed or anything. But sometimes life is terrible. And we say, when is God going to save me from this? And I believe the story of Esther teaches us that we have to meet God halfway on these things, or we have to be agents of God. We are created in God's image with God's godlike wisdom and creativity and free will, and we can do something about these bad situations. And so, this apparent hiddenness of God is just a reminder to us that we are partners in the ongoing co-creation of the world, right? And I got a little bit off the topic of costumes. I apologize for that. But these are all the reason we wear costumes is because this is a holiday of hiddenness. One, because Esther hides herself. One, because Haman hides his pettiness and in his encouraging the slaughter of the Jewish people. And one, because God appears to hide God's self in the text while working miracles through the hands of living beings. And so, for all these reasons, and because it's fun, we wear costumes on Purim. So that was kind of a long explanation. I give you three different reasons. Sometimes things, as academics and my teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, says, sometimes the reasons for doing something are overdetermined. There's more than one good reason. But I wanted to share that with you today while I wear a pretty bow in my hair. So you can learn serious Torah while being pretty as well. So I'm going to go into the comments to see what other people are saying. We got Sister Spooky as boo hiss. I said Haman boo a couple of times, and people are really getting into this. This is like great Purim spiel practice. Let's see what is going on here in the chat today. Everybody's giving each other high fives. Let's see. Sister Spooky asks, isn't the objective to simply make it so you don't recognize friend from foe? Very interesting comment, because part of the mitzvah of Purim is this kind of, what shall we say, ambivalence or ambiguity between who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. I believe it was Rabbi Ethan Tucker came out with an article this week talking about is Mordecai really the good guy of this story? I haven't read it yet, but I intend to, because we always paint Mordecai as the good guy. And yet maybe he's not. Maybe he shouldn't have let Esther go become queen in the first place, right? Maybe he should have been more encouraging to Esther instead of saying, well, if you don't reveal yourself, somebody will, so I don't care, whatever. Maybe he should have said, no, do it. Or maybe he should have said, no, don't, and spared her life and figured out a different way. So we can't always tell, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, right? Haman, boo, seems like a bad guy, but he sparked this great wave of pride in Jewish identity. Is that such a bad thing? I don't know. We'll talk more about the imbibing aspect of Purim tomorrow. One of the lesser mitzvot, I'll say, because we talked about the main mitzvot yesterday, is some say it's required to consume an intoxicant until you can't tell the difference between bracha Mordechai and Arur Haman, like the blessing of Mordechai and the cursing of Haman. This kind of interweaving or ambiguity between who's really a friend, who's really a foe. Or maybe Sister Spooky's point here is that maybe in Purim you can sort of suspend that whole dichotomy, right? You're in a community. You may have enemies or frenemies or people you don't get along with. Maybe you could suspend that kind of animosity or grief or tension for a night, for a day, just to celebrate this holiday together. So really excellent point, Sister Spooky. Let's see. I get some people having trouble with the video stream. I'm doing the best I can with my Wi-Fi here, y'all. Let's see. What else is going on? God withdraws at different points, but that's when we're expected to seek God. As far as being absent in Esther, not so. God was still there. It was God who allowed the scenario. So I'm not going to, again, a couple nights ago, I had a live stream scheduled mistakenly, and I didn't show up. But then what I saw was people get together and learn about Purim and chat with each other and have fun anyway. So that was my intention. And I'm not God. I'm not claiming anything like that. But sometimes when the person sort of coordinating things withdraws, it's amazing what people do in their absence. There's a teaching about, this is sort of a Kabbalistic teaching, about the creation of the world. When we have tohu, right? It says in the beginning there was sort of tohu vavohu. There was the world was unformed and void. This tohu isn't really a void. That's sort of a Christian idea of creation ex nihilo, that there was nothing there, but there was something there. But there's a Lurianic Kabbalistic cosmology that God pervaded extension infinitely to such an extent that God couldn't create the world. And God had to withdraw God's self from one small portion of extension so that God could fill that space with us. Like, to create the world, God had to withdraw God's self. And at various points in our story, God withdraws God's self to let us figure things out, right? How else would we learn? How else would we lead? How else could we exercise our free will and our knowledge of good and evil if we were always sort of taking directions and instructions and expecting miracles to fix stuff for us? Sometimes God withdraws for our own sake. It's like when you take, let's say, if you have a kid and you're teaching the kid how to ride a bicycle, eventually you have to take your hand off the bicycle seat and let them just coast down the street themselves. Because if you don't, the kid will never learn how to ride a bicycle. And so this hiddenness isn't a weakness or a fault of God's, but a positive move to help our growth. You didn't know that we were going to talk about this stuff with costumes, right? But they're intricately linked, right? This costume idea is that maybe we pull ourselves back. Maybe we normally have a certain kind of influence on our community. For one night of the year, we pull back from that and we try on something else. There are all sorts of psychoanalytical ideas that sometimes we put on costumes. And when we put those costumes on, it's not that we're covering up our true selves, but we're taking off the mask that we normally wear in the world to either put on a different mask or to reveal our true natures, right? Somebody might be, let's say, a computer programmer, but they always secretly wanted to be a fireman, right? And so maybe for Purim one year or every year, they dress up as a fireman. And that's not necessarily hiding their nature as a computer programmer. That's revealing something secret about themselves, that they always wanted to be a fireman. And maybe they might be someday. They're just sort of trying that out for Purim. So my blessing or encouragement for you is that as you're thinking about your Purim costume for this year, if you don't have it already picked out, consider maybe what you wanted to be when you grew up, when you were a kid, or consider something that you aspire to be and try that on. And maybe in a humorous way, because maybe that makes it more comfortable for you. But try it on. Like, try on a different identity that you have within yourself that you keep hidden most of the time, because there's a fine line between, hiddenness and, let's say, increased revelation, right? We learn how to do things when the guide to do those things is hidden. And that actually reveals things about ourselves that we didn't even know. So let's see what else is going on in the chat. Rotten Tomatoes on Haman. Boy, Haman, boo, is really getting a short shrift today. That's how you wipe out Amalek, people. I actually learned some interesting gematria yesterday from my teacher, mentor, and friend, Rabbi Dan Shevitz, when we were sitting on a Beit Din together, and he taught some Purim Torah. Actually gave me a real great insight, but in that passage about drunkenness and not being able to tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. So I'll share that with you yesterday. Save some for tomorrow, but we'll get into that in a second. All right, let's see what else Sister Spooky really contributing a lot today. God withdraws at different points, but that's when we're expected to seek God. God who allowed this scenario to play out so Israel was protected. So, God let this scenario play out so that we knew how to stand up and protect ourselves. So, a lot of trash in Haman today. I'm not gonna argue with you. He was a human being with feelings, was impaled on a stick with a big stick with all of his sons. So he kind of got his and then some. In the end, wasn't pleasant. Maybe he was asking for it, maybe not. But I don't know, maybe this is my costume today, is like the advocate for Haman. I don't know, but he's sort of an archetypal character. He's very much like the Iago, either in Othello or in the Disney movie Aladdin, depending on your preference. But he's a sort of advisor whispering poison into the king's ear to have bad effect. Also like Wormtongue, played by Brad Dourif in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So let's see what else is going on. And I'm just really excited everybody showed up with me today. We talked a lot about Purim costumes. Again, if you're just joining us, first of all, if you're just joining us for the first time, you should know that I've got like I'm like bordering on 200 videos in this channel. Lots of different stuff about Jewish holidays. For whatever reason, this is the first time I'm really doing videos about Purim. I haven't done a lot of Purim videos yet. A lot of stuff about the high holy days, but I haven't really touched so much on Hanukkah and Purim, and this year I hope to amend that. But we've got lots of videos for you to choose from. After you watch this one, feel free to jump into another one, talk a lot about Jewish topics, Jewish words, Jewish holidays, Jewish relationships, and your relationship to Judaism, sort of the Jew-curious person's way in, if you will. If you are just joining us, I want to recap. We're about to wrap it up. If you have any questions remaining about Purim costumes, how to pick your Purim costume, for example, go ahead and throw those in the chat. Just before we wrap up, I want to recap to say we have learned about the reason we wear costumes on Purim, and there are many layers to that. You could just say, hey, John, you don't need to get so heady about this. It's just fun to wear costumes, and when else do we, right? But in our case, we have at least 3 good reasons to wear costumes on Purim, and that is, it starts with this theme of Hester Panim, or hiding the face, or hiddenness. The most obvious example of which is Esther, whose birth name is Hadassah, so that's one level of hiddenness, but she hides her identity as a Jewish person in order to become part of the court of the king of the Persian Empire. So she hides herself and then reveals herself at a strategic moment in a brave way to save her people. The second reason, and this is more the kind of stuff you see in the classical texts, Haman hid his particular spite toward Mordecai and instead ginned up this, I'll say, eternal trope of dual loyalty about the Jewish people that we see even, I hate to talk about this, but like we see this even in the world today, and it's just as disgusting and false now as it was back then, and vice versa. But Haman ginned up this anti-Semitic trope of dual loyalty when really he was just ticked off at one guy who didn't want to play ball because of that one guy, Mordecai's relationship to God. And so Haman hid his personal beef in order to accomplish this goal of statecraft, I guess, but really it was just him being petty. And so then the third level of hiddenness is this anomaly within the scripture, within the Tanakh, the canonized Jewish text, that this is the one book where God's name does not appear once. And skeptics may say, does that mean that God was absent from this story, that God had no influence? And I would challenge that and say, no, God worked through people in that, and by performing that tzimtzum, that withdrawal, God actually taught us to be stronger people. Right? We had to exercise our own judgment, our own will, our own bravery in that moment, and we grew because of God's apparent but not actual withdrawal from us. And there's that's additional layer of Hester Panim, or the hiddenness of God's face. And so for all that, put a costume on, put a fancy bow in your hair. Get fancy, y'all. This is the time to do it. Some people recycle their Halloween costumes, or they recycle their Purim costumes for Halloween. Not everybody does Halloween. Some people do. But let's say this is your time to kind of let your hair down, right? And you can see that as either putting on an identity that's not your own just for laughs and giggles and stuff, or you can try on an identity that maybe you're afraid to reveal most of the year. So take full advantage of it. When else do you get to go hear a silly play at a synagogue, say, eat triangular cookies? These are from my friend Britton, gave me these yesterday. These are Hamantashen or Ozne Haman. And give gifts of food to your friends, especially give gifts of food or the resources to buy food to the poor. That's another important mitzvah. Go hear the Megillah. If you don't want to wear a costume, if you don't have a costume, don't be shy. Go anyway. Enjoy other people's costumes. But if you can, just, put a bow in your hair that you don't normally wear. So maybe this is an aspect about me that I like sparkly bows in my decreasing layer of hair here. So really enjoyed learning with everybody today. Let's see if there are any questions before we sign off. Let's see. Isn't there an objective to make it so one doesn't recognize friend from foe? We had that a little bit earlier. Yeah, I think that's legit. This sort of maybe hiding those lines between friends and enemies that may be spurious or lines that no longer serve us. Courtney said it would still be something they would like to do, yet they don't. So I really appreciate everybody showing up for this chat today. Always love learning with everybody here. I've seeing a lot of, let's say, return students, some new students, or for seeing people here for the first time in a while. That warms my heart. So I'll just say, next time we learn together, we will learn about the aspect of intoxication on Purim. We'll be talking about that 9 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow. There, on the one hand, there are those who say, both in the Talmud and in the law codes of the Shulchan Aruch, you are required to get intoxicated. And there are those within our same tradition in both of the books, in the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, that say, not so fast. Like, don't hurt yourself. Right? On the one hand, lay your hair down. On the other hand, don't be irresponsible. I'll share both sides of those arguments with you tomorrow and help you decide whether this is a year that you want to, let your sheets go to the wind, I guess, as the sailors say, or whether you want to feel justified in your restraint, which is also a Jewish value. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. And until next time, heroes, peace.